One of the great characters in our literature is King Lear, as conceived by William Shakespeare in his great tragicomic play. Lear decides he wants to retire from ruling and hand his kingdom over to his daughters. But he wants them to demonstrate their love and reverence for him, and thus a trap is set. His daughter Cordelia, who really does love her father, refuses to fawn over him. But her two sisters, Goneril and Regan, who do not love their father, but will sacrifice anything for their own personal ambition, are willing to say and do anything to win their father's prize. And so Lear banishes Cordelia and divides his kingdom between Goneril and Regan, and what follows is madness and tragedy. But one of the significant characters in King Lear appears only briefly on stage, and that is the fool, the court jester. Now, the fool has an esteemed place in our culture. Jesters, fools, and clowns often played a really important role in European courts where freedom of speech was very limited. They could often openly criticize the monarch through the use of humor, satire, and irony. The idea was that the fool was touched in some way. The belief was that he was touched by God, and so thus the fool could get away with saying and doing things that other people could not. But sometimes the fool may have been really the only sane person, which is the role here in King Lear. The fool realizes Lear's mistake in surrendering his kingdom to Goneril and Regan and banishing Cordelia. He tries to warn the king, who is too blinded by his stubbornness and pride to really hear what is being told. The fool bemoans his situation of knowing the truth and not being heard by saying, "I had rather be any kind of thing than a fool." And almost immediately after that utterance, Goneril reappears to begin what will become her reign of terror upon her father. Upon her appearance, the fool says to the king, "I am better than thou art now. I am a fool. Thou art nothing." Well, the popular religious writer Frederick Buechner has written on the religious significance of this play, and in particular on the character of the fool. Citing St. Paul in his first letter to the Church of Corinth, that God chose what is foolish in this world to shame the wise. Buechner then writes of Shakespeare's King Lear that not only are the foolish wise in this play, and the wise foolish, just as the weak are strong in it and the strong weak, but what seems at first to be nothing, Cordelia's love, turns out to be something of surpassing importance. It is almost possible to think of Shakespeare as having written the entire play as a gloss on St. Paul, adding to it such other paradoxes of his own as that it is the mad who are sane, and the sane who are mad, and of course it is the blind who really see, and those with sight who are truly blind. Well, what is madness and sanity? What rational and irrational? What is true love and what just dissembling speech and action? What is foolishness and what is truth? Well, these questions can be interestingly relevant for us. I'm assuming what is love or what's dissembling is relevant to us at times in our lives. But for example, this week, some of our state legislators engaged in a little political theater of their own with a proclamation of morality. They used a handful of quotes from the Founding Fathers in order to support their idea of the United States as a Christian evangelical nation. Well, at best, of course, these quotes are taken completely out of context, and at worst, as some independent research showed, some of the quotes are not known to exist in the writings or statements of the speakers that anyone even knows about. So to distort history in the service of a proclamation of morality is something that one could expect from a Shakespearean villain or comedian. I think that you have to love irony if you live in the state of Oklahoma, because our public life is filled with it. Well, Paul here in 2 Corinthians engages in some irony in our lectionary text in what scholars call the fool's speech. Paul is boasting, and in the process, he's making a fool of himself. But it's intentional. He really wants the Corinthians who are hearing this to laugh at him and mock him. You see, Paul had been deeply hurt by his critics in Corinth, these super apostles, as he calls them, who've been boasting about their own knowledge, experience, and greater ability. Compared with them, Paul comes across as weak and cowardly. Now, some of Paul's rhetoric in chapters 10 to 13 is troubling. He has been so deeply hurt that in places he lashes out at the Corinthians. He uses language that demonizes his opponents. He calls them false apostles and even compares them to Satan. His pain, his disappointment, his anger are evident. And he tries to cover them up by using some humor to lighten the tension. An age-old strategy that I'm sure that we all use at times. And so the humor that Paul uses is what is called fool's speech. You see, he decides to go along with his critics, that he too is going to boast. But it's the kind of boasting that ends up exaggerating and playing it over the top. For example, in chapter 11, beginning verse 23, are they ministers of Christ? And by the way, he embeds cues in the text, like, I'm talking like a madman. I am a better one, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless floggings, and often near death. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I have been beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was drifted at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, and it keeps going on and on. Danger, danger, Bill Robinson. You see, Paul's playing a character. And in a sense, here he's kind of like Ralph Cram, that great Jack Gleason character from The Honeymooners. Ralph, you'll remember, was so poor that he couldn't even afford curtains for the windows in the kitchen. Yet Ralph had that oversized sense of entitlement and of his own glory, puff out his chest and just bellow. So if you imagine Ralph Cramden reading this section of 2 Corinthians, you might get the kind of humor that Paul is using. And in another way, it's like Ralph, in that we know that Paul, too, is boasting to cover up his own hurt and insecurities. But did you notice something else about this list of boasts? They really are not the sort of things that one normally boasts about. Beatings, stonings, shipwrecks, unless, of course, one is masked. In fact, Paul's opponents are the ones boasting about their courage, their strength, their brilliance. And so, if Paul boasts about weakness and suffering, isn't he only reinforcing his opponent's criticisms? Well, another example from chapter 11. In verses 32 and 33, he tells the story of his escape from Damascus. That his enemies were after him, and through cunning, he was let down over the wall in a basket. Now, when I was told this story in Sunday school as a kid, we were told it's a story of bravery and cunning. But the funny thing is that's exactly the opposite of what Paul is intending here. Paul knows that the audience hearing this story will think that he was a coward for escaping in which the way he did. Within the cultural context,